Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, we talk about why the tech curation website Techmeme decided to launch a daily podcast. In 2005, a computer software engineer named Gabe Rivera launched a site that would eventually become Techmeme. Governed by algorithms, Techmeme aggregated the day's tech news, and it eventually became so influential that bloggers and journalists would vie to get their articles featured on the site. Flash forward to 2018, and Techmeme announced that it would expand its news curation into a daily podcast. I recently sat down with host Brian McCullough to talk about how he came up with the idea for a daily tech podcast and what he's doing to expand it into an entire podcast network. Before we jump into the interview, I wanted to talk about my email newsletter. If you're not subscribed, then you're missing out on some of the most in-depth analysis on the media industry that you'll find anywhere. This week, for instance, I wrote a 1,000-word piece about why it's so difficult to make a living as a freelance journalist. If you're not subscribed, then you should pause this episode right now and go to simonowens.substack.com to sign up. But don't just take my word for it. Here's media entrepreneur Alexis Grant explaining why she thinks people should sign up for the newsletter.
I think there's two types of people who could benefit from your newsletter. The first is people who are working in media at startups or big companies and who need to figure out how to stay ahead of the curve, how to stay on top of what's happening with platforms, for example, that we rely on to distribute content. So people who are kind of one piece of a greater media company. And that could be like a leader at a company, or it could be a doer at a company, somebody that's executing all these pieces. And then the second type of person that I think could benefit from your newsletter is someone who is more of an entrepreneur who is building their own thing or wants to build their own thing. And I think that's the reason why I'm so attracted to your newsletter, because I basically fall into both camps. So until recently I was working at a bigger company, at a media startup, and I'm also always interested in doing my own thing, and I've done that in the past, and I'm probably going to do that again. And so your newsletter kind of brings together all those pieces for me, and it's also really diverse in terms of what you cover. So I'm really interested in distribution and monetization, but you also you sometimes you'll cover social media, sometimes you'll cover the monetizing piece or the audience building and the community piece. And so those are the pieces that are always, I think those are really practical.
Again, if you want to subscribe, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Okay, now let's jump to my interview with Techmeme's Brian McCullough. Hey, Brian, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Simon. Happy to be here.
So you're the host of the Techmeme Ride Home podcast. That's a daily podcast, right?
That is every day at 5 p.m. What happened today in the world of tech for your commute home. And also now we have, because I'm an insane maniac, we also have weekend bonus episodes. So some months we're pretty close to a 7 days a week, 30 or so episodes a month podcast.
Yeah, so I like how it's explicit in the name Ride Home. So it seems like you guys were trying to specifically, a lot of daily podcasts do this where they're kind of targeting the commuter, but you're putting it right there in your title that you're thinking commuters are your target demographic.
Well, it's weird. We've been doing this for so long now. I think, it's a year and 4 months or something, which doesn't seem like a long time. But, when we launched, basically it was the daily that was out there, or at least when we started conceiving of it, it was mainly the daily. I know there were other daily podcasts as well. But so the thinking was, the daily's in the morning. Let's go in the afternoon. We were early enough that there didn't seem to be other afternoon pods out there, but also it's purely workflow, because I don't want to work through the night and post a show at 5 a.m. I live in the US, I've got kids or whatever. Like maybe if I was in Britain or something, it would be different. But it's basically, we want to hit people. You were busy at work today. Hopefully you weren't on Twitter and all the blogs and everything. I was. So here you go.
Yeah. And it also kind of fits in with the theme of Techmeme in general. So I think most of the people who listen to my podcast know what Techmeme is, but just in case they don't, give us a sense of what Techmeme as a website is.
Yeah, it's a news aggregation site. It's been around for the better part of 2 decades now, but it's not a news aggregation site like the Huffington Post or something that you would think of. It's literally headlines. It's updated minute by minute throughout the day. Like they always say that people check Techmeme 20, 30 times a day, because, you can check at the top of the hour and 45 minutes later, like the slate of headlines is completely different, and it's all headlines. And so it's pointing to, this story broke, TechCrunch said this, and, The Verge said this, and people tweeted this about it. And so that's right. That's one of the reasons why we did it daily, is because it wouldn't make sense to do a Techmeme podcast that would be, an end of the week roundup. First of all, there's a ton of those out there. Some of them done very well. You get a bunch of idiots around a table and you say, you kick around what happened in the week. But the point of
this
Techmeme,
week in tech is that's the kind of classic model, is the four
right.
tech journalists sitting around and they just go kind of subject by subject and tackle each one, discuss it until they're bored discussing it, and move on to the next.
Right, but we were like, well, what is the value proposition of Techmeme? It's here's what you missed. You were in a meeting, you were busy in the morning, whatever. So that's the concept of the podcast. Here's what you missed in the world of tech today.
And Techmeme is cool and kind of differentiated from a lot of other sites is because it's a mixture of algorithms and human editors, right?
Yeah, actually, right. That's a whole interesting side story, is that it originally was Gabe came up with, I don't know, I've never even been privy to how I can see the back end on a day-to-day basis, but I don't actually know how the algorithms and things work. But I don't know how many years ago he decided that wasn't good enough, that you needed actually people to put their thumbs on the scales, and then actually the editors not only decide, this is the most important story, this is the third most important story, they write the headlines and things like that. So like you can see in the Slack channel all day long, like arguing about like what's important and this is how we should title it and things like that. But also they're working 24/7. There are overnight editors every single day. They're tag team editors. There's almost no time when there's only one editor working. So there's multiple people. So it's people finding the news, deciding what's important, and giving it context.
Yeah, and I think I remember when he announced that he was kind of switching over from purely algorithm to more of an editor-based approach, and I think he was frustrated with headlines a lot of the times. Sometimes the headlines didn't really, they kind of buried the lead, and he wanted to draw out like what was the most important, thing from a piece of news, and then also just add a little bit more news judgment, and because I think there was a lot of complaints from tech bloggers back in the day of, I broke this story, but TechCrunch got credit and different stuff like that.
Well, there still are those complaints on a daily basis, but.
And that was also a little bit of more of the genius of Techmeme, is it gamified everything. Because I don't know if they still do it today, but back in the heyday, the golden age of tech blogging, there were these like leaderboards.
They're still there.
Yeah, they're still there. But I feel like they were paying attention to it more. Maybe they still are paying attention.
Listen,
I feel like now that mainstream news journalists have gotten into the fray, that's happening a little bit more. Because like there was a period of time where there were just pure blogs kind of owned the tech space for a while. But now that they're competing with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and stuff like that, I don't know if that competition is as fierce, since they're kind of...
Well, let me do Gabe a solid here, because he introduced about 6 months ago a new product where if you're a PR person, you can buy a report based on Techmeme's data. Like if you're thinking of leaderboards in tech, like it used to be, for any, topic, who is the most trusted or the most cited source in crypto, in electronic vehicles, in self-driving cars and whatever. So like that is a product that Gabe launched recently. If there's PR people listening and you need to know who is the go-to person to pitch in any vertical, there is a report that you can now buy from them.
Is it just journalists, or like I know that Techmeme now like aggregates like Twitter and stuff like that, so you can find
it would be mainly the writers, the journalists.
Yeah, interesting. So what's your history with the website, like both as a reader and someone who works with it?
Oh God, I feel like I can remember the day that it was probably TechCrunch. It was probably Michael Arrington, back when Michael Arrington was the only writer at TechCrunch, when he first announced that Techmeme exists. And I probably made that my number one bookmark as soon as he announced it or told me that it existed. Like it's funny because in a weird way, all I've done for the last 15 years or however old Techmeme is read Techmeme all day in between doing the other things that I've been doing for the last 15 years. It's just now that I have a job where it's like it's useful to do that, and there's actually utility and something comes out of my obsessive reading of the site.
And did you join the site in some way as a staff member before the podcast, or was that how did you get connected directly to its people?
No. So Gabe and I have known each other for several years. I don't know how long ago. And the long story of it, of how I ended up doing the podcast with Techmeme is that. So I don't know if we're going to get into this later, but I've been doing the Internet History podcast for 5 years. And 2 years ago now, I had gotten reached out to by a brand that shall remain nameless to do a tech podcast for them. And I mentioned it offhand to Gabe that, by the way, if I do a tech podcast for them, I'm just going to be, reading Techmeme every day and just regurgitating. Have you ever thought of doing a podcast? And he's like, well, funny you should mention that. Yes. Why don't you do it? And that's when we had the discussion about like, well, what is good about Techmeme? And so that's when we, made the decision that the only thing that made sense to us was to do it as a daily.
And so you mentioned this history of podcasting, history of the internet podcast, but you were, kind of in the online media space prior to that. You founded a bunch of websites, right?
Yeah. I don't know that you could call it media. All of them, it was, I founded 3 different companies in the early 2000s. They were all in the online job search space, essentially. But yeah, I founded my first company in 1999. So, right. I've been in the mix in terms of in the tech world, that long. All that happened was, 5 or 6 years ago, I decided I wanted to write, a book about the history of the internet and not going back to, the ARPANET and all that stuff. But, basically my career, the book ends up starting with the Netscape IPO and goes through the launch of the iPhone. It came out in October, by the way. It's called How the Internet Happened, from Netscape to the iPhone. So this is my accidental entree into podcasting. I am doing all the research in this book. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a historian or whatever, but I knew people in the industry. So I'm reaching out to various folk and, getting early, the employee number 1 at Amazon, the founding engineering team at Netscape, and I'm recording the interviews. I'm doing them over Skype, and I'm like, I'm a web guy. I'm used to getting having an idea, throwing it up there, and seeing what works, and getting instant feedback and things like that. So I'm collecting all these interviews, and I'm like, 3 or 4 years from now, maybe a sentence from that hour-long interview will be in the book. So why don't I just throw up the interviews as podcasts? So that's the Internet History Podcast. Like I said, it's been running for 5 years. We're approaching 200 episodes. So that's how I accidentally got into podcasting, because the Internet History Podcast took off, and I almost didn't end up writing the book. I had to be talked back into making it into a book because, all of a sudden you've got 75,000 people listening to you every week. And like I said, I like the immediate feedback and gratification. And so that's what sort of floated my boat.
Yeah, that's kind of an idea I had separately, because I kind of want to eventually write a book, and I was thinking, like, if I'm going to have to conduct interviews for this book, so I might as well record them as kind of like podcast interviews. But I would and my idea is I would save those specific interviews until the book was published, and then run an interview a week, and then each one would strongly plug the book, so it could work as a marketing vehicle.
I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Because I did it kind of both ways. Like my model was sort of, there's 2 models of podcasting, right? There's the Mark Maron model. You sit down with a microphone and you have an interview. And then there's like the Dan Carlin hardcore history model, or the, what's that Hollywood one?
The history of Hollywood. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Where you write out a script and you read it. So I kind of did both. So if you listen to the Internet History Podcast, you will hear me read early drafts of chapters in the book. So you can hear chapters 1, 2, and 3. And I was releasing them in real time. And it was great because I was getting not only feedback, but like corrections from the listeners. And then, so if I'm doing a chapter on eBay, a listener would be like, well, I know so-and-so, let me put you in touch with them and things like that. So I actually really recommend, if you want to write a book, sort of doing it as a podcast, like as a crowdsourcing thing is not the dumbest thing in the world. Right. You have to make the decision in terms of how much you give away and things like that. But I don't know, like it really helped my process. And again, I had, that's my first book. I'd not been a writer before that.
If you weren't a journalist, how did you convince these important people to talk to you? Like, is it like you had a book deal in hand? Was that enough to?
Oh no, I didn't. I didn't have a book deal in hand till about 3 years into it. Well, that's an excellent question, and it's a question that I ask myself sometimes. It helped that I, have been in the tech industry for 20 years. So I did know people that could vouch for me and things like that. But yeah, I don't know why John Mittelhauser, inventor of the browser cookie and early Netscape engineer, why did he agree to talk to me when there were only 3 episodes of the podcast? Even I don't know. I actually don't know the answer.
That was actually an early insight. I was a very early blogger, started my first blog in 2003, and then I started like doing like actual journal. I became like a newspaper journalist, but then I started incorporating those skills into this blog I had, which was called Blogasm, which I no longer own. But like that was one of my first early insights, is like you'd be surprised like how much people's egos really just being asked to be interviewed, even if they haven't heard of you, how important of people will actually agree to interviews. Like some people are way too important and they won't, but I was surprised by how many people would, just some random blogger that they had never heard of, how many people would agree to get on the phone with me and
subsequently, in reverse, it's happening right now, but it is a big ego boost. Like you get a high off of like, oh, someone wants to hear about what you did or whatever. And if you look at those early Internet History Podcast episodes, there are people that maybe hadn't had their story told before. Like it's not Mark Andreessen, it's the early Netscape engineering team. It's the guys that made the first banner ads. So it's like I was the first person to be like, hey, tell your story. And like that was sort of the thing that I offered them. I'm like, it's unedited. Like, just tell me how you remember it. So like it's giving people the ability to tell the story in their words, as opposed to, again, like just getting a sentence or two in a oral history or something like that. Now I've been through a whole evolution. Now, when I contact various people, they're like, how come it took you, you're 200 episodes in, how come it took you so long to get to me, and that sort of thing. And actually, I get pitched by PR people all the time now. I mean, that's the benefit of 200 episodes and like big name people on the show now and doing it for 5 years or whatever. But I don't know, if you just churn out good work, it's like a snowball rolling downhill. I guess it accumulates mass.
Yeah, I've noticed that with my own podcast. Like I'm 50 episodes in now, and I'm starting to finally see like those benefits accrue of having a very long. Like I'm getting bigger and bigger guests. Like I just had like the president of Vox Media on. That's probably one of the higher level guests that I've had. And it gets easier and easier, as you build it up. Where did you see, or what did you notice from an audience building perspective? Like how did it start gaining traction?
It's funny. There were 2 things that probably are not replicatable. Well, one of them might be like if you launch a podcast and you get in new and noteworthy in iTunes. Like I think I had 1,000 subscribers in my first 48 hours because of that. But that's because somebody at Apple thought that was, that's a good idea for a podcast, and so they put it up there. Another thing is again. Well, actually, several times I would tie things around things like when Halt and Catch Fire came out. Like I interviewed Rod Canyon, the one of the founders of Compaq, because that's sort of what that show was based on, is the story of Compaq, and so then that got picked up. Like it's also like you pick people and they have social media followings and they tweet about it, but like random things. Like I randomly got put in touch with one of the co-founders of Tesla, which is sort of outside the scope of the Internet History Podcast. But then, it was a good interview and it got picked up by all the auto blogs and things like that. But then also one of the biggest things, which is unreplicatable, was for a while, Product Hunt had a podcast category. And so you could post your recent podcast episodes and people would vote it and upvote it and things like that. And that was huge, actually. And I wish they would bring it back because it was great.
Really? Because when I looked at it, it didn't look like it was getting any engagement at all. Because I remember looking at that vertical, and just because I wanted to see if it was driving any traffic.
I'll tell you what,
podcasters, but it didn't. It seemed like each one had like maybe a handful of upvotes.
I do not know how many actual listeners it got, but it certainly turned a lot of important tech people, especially in the VC space, onto the show. Like if you look at some of the, if you look through the timeline of guests, like you can see when I started posting to Product Hunt and things like that. And so, yeah, it was a different caliber of people that were suddenly turned on to it, and then they were willing to come on the show. So yeah, I don't know. It's there's no magic bullet to any of these things. It's like, again, just keep doing good work, turn the levers that you can turn. Play the angles you can play, and I don't know, if you stay alive long enough, hopefully eventually it gets traction in mass.
The Internet History Podcast, it's a long podcast. Like I think like each episode's over an hour long. What's your philosophy on shorter podcasts versus that those that go over like an hour? Does a longer podcast drive any additional benefits?
No, I don't think so. I mean, one of the things, because I'm affiliated with TED because I was a TED resident a couple years ago, and so I do twice a year for them a podcast workshop for the new TED residents. And one of the things that I always say is like the thing about podcasting is like it can be whatever you want. That's one of the amazing things. Like as much as I like the Gimlets of the world and things like that, where they chop everything down into like a 20-minute perfect, beautifully edited, but edited within an inch of its life sort of thing. Like there's also room for the Joe Rogan or the Pete Holmes, like 3 and 4 hour long things. Right. So in a sense, what podcasting is it's radio. And so radio has had all sorts of like, there's the 2-minute news drop at the top of an hour. There's the Rush Limbaugh or Howard Stern on for 5 hours. And so you play it in the background. So I that's one of the things I always say at these podcast workshops, like, let it be whatever you want. There's that really popular podcast where it's like, I think it's like a daily 2-minute, what is it? Grammar Girl or something like that.
Grammar Girl, Mignon Fogarty.
Right. Do whatever you want. Like, if it works for people, if it's something they want to consume, and that gets us back into the daily conversation. Like if it's a thing where you discover a podcast and you binge the back catalog, like, my favorite one of that is like the Flophouse, or there's some podcast, Go Bayside. I never ever watched a 5 minutes of Saved by the Bell, but I listened to all the episodes of Go Bayside just because it was fantastic to hear them recap it. They brought on comedians and things. Or if you like our shows like we're doing now with the Ride Home shows, where it fits into that's the fascinating thing, is that we fit into people's daily routines. And like, I'm actually talking to you right now, and I'm worried about the fact that one of our channels hasn't posted yet, and I'm going to start to get angry tweets about people being like, it's almost 5:30, I got to leave work and I don't have your show yet for my commute home. Like, it's however you can fit into people's lives. I think that's the beauty of podcasting.
Yeah. One thing I have been frustrated with tech podcasts is a lot of them are really long, and I was on the lookout for something shorter, and that's why I was a big fan of, before it closed down, with the Jay and Farid show, because it was just such a, I don't know if you ever listened to that show, but it was such a casual, by the seat of their pants type of thing, where they didn't even know what they were talking about before.
Can I tell you something?
Sure.
So the Techmeme Ride Home, on our weekend bonus episodes, I have done 2 Jay and Farhad show reunions thus far, and our agreement is that we'll do them about once a quarter. So if you want to relive the Jay and Farhad magic, you can. I've done 2 of them, and yeah, I love those guys, and I wish they would come back as well.
So before we get into the Techmeme podcast, what's the business model for the Internet History Podcast?
It's not. It was something that I did as a way to build an audience for the book. The book came out in October. Why am I continuing? Because I sort of still love it as a hobby. I used to do it weekly. It's now down to bi-weekly. And I have added ads So, it kicks in a couple $1,000s a month or whatever.
Did it help drive sales of the book at all? That you can tell?
Yeah, it did. But I mean, I don't know. I don't know how to measure that because, again, I'd never written a book before. Like, the book did fine. Like, we earned back our advance, which is what I understand is, apparently really good, and, sold out our first printing and things like that. But it wasn't, a bestseller or anything like that. I can't. It's weird because I've used now podcasts to launch other podcasts. And so I can't quite quantify to what degree the podcast audience was helpful in selling the book versus I can tell you with a dead certainty, like when I use podcasts to launch other podcasts or to even, I don't know, tweet about something or like start a subreddit or whatever, like there are very tangible, I can measure it almost with numbers, and I was surprised that didn't seem to carry over to book sales, but I don't know. Book sales, everything seems weird about it. Like, you get a glowing review in the Wall Street Journal or whatever, and you sell 500 additional copies that week, and you're like, that's it? I don't know. But that's a side tangent.
Well, certainly you wouldn't have the Techmeme gig if it weren't for the other podcast. So you could.
Oh, sure, yeah, no, it's rolling into
stuff like that.
Yeah, one rolling into the other. And so, I mean, that's the financial success of the Techmeme ride home is that, leveraging the brand of Techmeme. I didn't launch Brian's daily tech news show. I launched the Techmeme ride home. And so that's been very helpful. Our ad inventory has been sold out since June of last year. And so everything's going gangbusters for that.
So, walk me through this lead up to the Techmeme podcast. So you say, Gabe, you guys should, be doing this, doing a daily podcast for the evening. So tell me what was the thinking as you were going through and kind of gearing up to launch it?
Well, Gabe, to his credit, said, all right, go do it. It's a rev share. I technically own the show, but I kick a certain percentage of whatever we make back to Techmeme. Because Gabe and I knew each other, and I guess because Gabe knew I could do this with the Internet History Podcast or whatever. I have, not only do I own it, I have total editorial control, and as long as I don't do something insane and embarrassing, it seems to be going well so far. It's funny. I don't know, like, having run businesses before and having customers is one thing, but then it's not, this sounds horrible to say, like, this is a humble brag sort of thing, but like having fans is a completely different thing. Like when I was on the book tour and I would go to a city, and I'd be like, hey, I'm going to be in Boston signing books on Friday night. And I'd announce it on the Techmeme show. And a dozen people would show up. Actually, we're going to do a meetup here in New York as soon as I can get my schedule together or whatever. But like, so it's crazy to me that, again, like if something goes wrong with a show, if the show's late, like I'll get a deluge of tweets and like, if I mention something about my personal life on the show, like I'll get, congratulations or, I'm sorry, or here's what you should do, that sort of thing. It's so fascinating to have an audience and a following. Like it's a crazy but crazy good thing.
Yeah, you hear about hosts talking about the intimacy where they'll mention some kind of back problem so offhandedly in a single episode. Then a year later, they'll meet someone in person and they'll be like, hey, "How's your back?" And they've already forgotten that it happened, but this person like remembered it because these people are speaking.
Well, and you know that too. I know it for sure. Like if I ever met Paul F. Tompkins or somebody like that, like I first of all would be starstruck, but I'd be like, I feel like I know you, dude.
Yeah.
Can't we be friends? I think we're already friends in my mind, and I get that, but that's you were talking about this on Twitter this morning. When people say that podcasting is an intimate medium, it is for reals. You are in someone's head. Again, especially with a daily show, you're part of their routine. But even not with a daily show, like Mondays for me are comedy bang bang days. Wednesdays are nerd poker days. Like I build my week around expecting these things to happen and like evolving with the show and with the hosts and stuff like that. It is no joke, and I think that's why the advertising, at least so far, seems to be so effective for people.
How did having the Techmeme brand behind you help in terms of growing the audience like more quickly than like an independent podcaster might have to deal with?
Everyone knows the Techmeme brand, or at least in Silicon Valley, people do. Right, because we and I hope you won't think I'm like trying to push this into plugging our other show or whatever. But so we 3 months or so ago, we launched a new daily called The Primary Ride Home that's covering the presidential primary.
For Memorandum, which is a sister site, right?
I'm sorry. No. So again, Techmeme is completely separate. Like I have a new startup called Ride Home Media. Uh-huh. So my co-founder in this is a veteran of Hearst and a bunch of other Digital Spy, a whole bunch. So he's a digital media veteran, and so the concept is we're hopefully going to have a universe of rides home in any vertical you can imagine. Which, before we go, remind me to plug that again, because we need creatives to pitch us new shows because we want to launch more. Anyway, back to the point I was trying to make. So like I said, we launched the Techmeme Ride Home last year, and we got advertisers from day one wanting to be on it. And that's entirely because of Techmeme. Believe me, the getting advertisers interested in the primary Ride Home, I'm realizing now I was blessed when we launched the Techmeme Ride Home, because it's going well, and the primary Ride Home is approaching break even in terms of audience numbers and what we can sell against it. But oh man, was it different. It wasn't just, okay, turn on the lights and have the advertisers come to you. No, we had to do some shaking the trees to get advertisers to the primary Ride Home.
What's your kind of advertiser strategy? Because I know Techmeme has an advertising platform. Are they feeding you the advertisers, or are you having to go out and hunt them down yourself? Like what's that?
Yeah. So again, for the Techmeme show, yes, some of it is inbound from Techmeme. But I'd say 60% of our ad inventory on the Techmeme show is direct sale, either via Techmeme or contacting me directly. And it's one of those things, we're 30,000 of the most connected people in Silicon Valley listen to the Techmeme Ride Home every day. So like, I've done things before on that show where I'm like, hey, I've got 2 open ad slots. Is anybody out there listening want to fill it? And, the last time I did that, I got 15 different advertisers wanting to fill it. So again, the Techmeme show is blessed. And then the rest of it is just playing with, we have relationships with all of the different agencies, and it's just a matter of floating. There's a huge tech company that hopefully is going to come in. We've been talking with them to snap up Q3 and Q4 stuff, and basically we'd be sold out through the end of the year. But again, when what I'm realizing now is, like, for the primary Ride Home, it's like, okay, we've had to go to the agencies and been like, this is a politics show. It's more urban. It has more. It's actually way more balanced in terms of male and female than the Techmeme show is. And so I've had, in the last 3 months, a super huge education about, like, yeah, you don't just turn on a podcast and the advertisers flock. You actually have to do the work of making it happen.
And like, are you able to? There's all these talks about supposedly podcasts are getting higher CPMs. Like, feel like you're getting really good ad rates, especially for the Techmeme podcast?
I've never sold an ad for under a $30 CPM. I don't know if that is also a humble brag or something, but yeah, it's as far as I can tell, and we've had advertisers re-up 5 and 6 times now. And we've had advertisers tell us that, like, this is the best, most effective channel. And again, if you're especially for the Techmeme show, if you're like a data ops company or something like that, where else are you going to find 30,000 of the devs and workers at startup companies, the guys and girls in the trenches that have to do this stuff every day? Like, we're a super valuable audience for them. I don't know where else you could go to aggregate that sort of thing. So there's a ton of people that have been with us like almost literally from day one and have never stopped buying.
What goes into creating it every day? Walk me through your day.
Get in, check the Techmeme editor Slack channel. Check Techmeme, see what is at the top of the site. Go into the Techmeme backend, see what the editors are considering going with for the next several hours, and then literally, blitz reading and putting together a script. And it's news aggregation, and it is, again, for this new company, we're calling it TLDR as a service. Like, my job is I'm online all day long, reading the blogs, reading the tweets. This site says this person says this, Elon Musk says this. And so like, I'm contextualizing it for you. You were busy leading your life, and so on your way home, I'm going to catch you up. It is, in a way, it's almost like, because you're saying you were very early in blogging, like that's what blogging was too, where in the way that, like, a news thing would happen and then you want to go see what John Gruber said about it or whatever. But it also, a lot of the Huffington Post stuff was like, well, in any niche, like, would it be useful for someone to, in a 15 to 20 minute podcast at the end of the day, catch you up on it? And that's what this new company, and again, don't let me forget to ask people, our thought is that it could be any niche. It could be gardening, it could be bonsai trees. We're obviously thinking, gaming, celeb news, things like that.
What about media?
Anything? Oh, heck yeah, exactly. Well, also, what if you could do a local one?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, what if it was the San Diego ride home? So, like, that's what we're looking for now. We're about to launch show 3, but so I'll go ahead and do this now. Anyone that's listening right now that has an expertise in a niche, if there's a subreddit out there that has even 30 or 50,000 subscribers, in theory, that could be a ride home show. And so come pitch it to us. Our site is ridehome.info. And our model is that it's a franchise thing. So whoever launches a show with us, it's a revenue share. So all we need, the way our economics work is, if a show gets to 30,000, to an audience of 30,000 listeners every day, not only is it wildly profitable for us, but the podcast partner, the producer, the host, whatever you want to call it, would be making into the 6 figures. So if you got a show to 50, 70, 100,000 listeners every day, you'd be talking about, you'd have enough money to have your own staff and that sort of thing. But it's very much a franchise model. And that's the whole reason why I did the Techmeme show to begin with, is my idea was to test out dailies as a model. And so that's what we're trying to do. And hopefully there will be a whole universe of rides home very soon.
So you're reading all day, you're reading tech news, trying to sort, like, what are the most important stories. And then you're writing a script, right, that you're going to be reading yourself.
Yes, writing a script and then recording it and editing it. And so you and I started talking at 5 p.m. today. So the show mostly went live at 4:30. Some days I'm later. Some days there are problems. Yeah, but it is sort of a one-man band thing. I think of the old Nick Denton model of paying people to write 30 posts a day. But the difference being is that he was paying them peanuts. And in theory, if you work with us and you launch a ride home, it could be anything. It could be the Cincinnati Bengals ride home. You're going to have to work your ass off. You're going to have to do it all yourself, at least at the beginning. But we won't be paying you peanuts because, again, it's a whole franchise idea.
So we talked about how having Techmeme's name associated with it drove audience for the podcast. What about vice versa? Do you think it's like helping strengthening, if it's Techmeme's becoming even more of someone's day, be extending into audio, that you're driving some value back? I don't know if it's been measured at all through analytics, but is there being value that's driven back to Techmeme?
I'm sure. I'm not privy to any sort of data on things like that, but yeah, absolutely. I'm sure. I'm sure some significant percentage of the daily podcast audience might not have known about Techmeme before.
And so this is a daily podcast, and there's been a lot, and obviously this entire company that you're launching is focused around daily. There's been a lot written about how daily podcasts can scale and grow a lot more quickly. Obviously, there's been a lot of ink spilled about the daily at the New York Times and how humongous its audience has grown to really quickly because they become routine habits for listeners. Like, do you think that that's the case, that like daily podcasts are operating just on a different level of scale and audience potential than, the average weekly podcast, which is probably the cadence of most podcasts out there?
I don't know that scale is the right word, but what I've said to people before is that the daily podcast audience are the podcast ultras. They're the most committed, right? And maybe, and in theory, they might be harder to hook, but if you hook them, they are the most committed. And you can, like, I still subscribe to Mark Maron's show, but I don't know the last time I listened to it. Like, it's one of those things where you pull it up in your podcatcher and you're like, is that someone I want to listen to? Like, it's almost like guest specific. Or again, like, I ran through the entire back catalog of the Flophouse, or you come and go with a show, like whatever. I'm not going to badmouth some show that I don't listen to anymore, but and I'm sure there's audience churn in daily shows, but I don't know, especially if you're delivering news, if you can become a daily habit, like, again, those are the most committed listeners. Those are the people for whom it's not just, is that someone that I want to listen to? Is that I'm no longer interested in this show or whatever? You're providing an actual daily utility. And I think that has more stickiness, as they used to say in the early 90s for web stuff, than other types of podcasts.
So you do this daily scripted summary, but on weekends you've been doing interviews. What's the strategy there?
Actually, well, aside from more inventory, which, again, we had been sold out, so it was like, we're raising our rates and things like that, and it's also, well, but if you could just deliver us more inventory, we could sell more ads. Aside from the gross dollars and cents of it, one of the things is like, something will happen. Like, okay, so for this week, E3, the big video games conference happened this week, and so a lot of headlines came out of E3. So like, sometimes I just want to do a deeper dive into something. So like, last week was WWDC, the Big Apple event. So the weekend episode was a wrap up, a debrief of WWDC. Or we'll talk about something like, all sorts of stuff has been happening around the idea of regulating the big tech companies or something. So I'm hunting and pecking around right now for someone smart to come on and talk to me for 20 minutes about, like, well, what does that really mean? Like, what would functionally breaking up or regulating the big tech platforms mean? It's just the weekend episodes are just a way for me to dive deeper into whatever we've been talking about on a daily basis.
And so, like, you're finding some kind of like journalist who might is it mainly like journalists who have covered these?
Oh, I've done both, and I would love to have more news breaking people. I mean, I've had journalists on, I've had venture capitalists on, I've had founders of companies on. I actually, as much as I don't want to be like a PR device for any companies or whatever, but if a company's breaking news, you come on my show. I'll give you 20 minutes to talk about whatever news you want to break or something like that. With some caveats that I might not take every pitch, but it doesn't really matter to me. We've done everything from a weekend episode about like what it takes to to design the new version of Helvetica and things like that, or like a roundtable discussion of like, will self-driving cars really ever come, or is the technology too far away? It doesn't really matter. It's just another way. I love doing the headlines, but I also love digging deeper. So in a way, the weekend episodes are just to indulge my sort of curiosity, I guess.
If you look at like the production staff for shows like The Daily or Vox's Today Explain, they have like full production teams. These are very highly produced podcasts. Yours is mainly you. There's a little bit of intro music, but there's not a lot of like audio design and stuff like that. You know, as your audience grows, you say that you're getting, well into the six figures, it generates more revenue. Do you have any hopes kind of in the future to expand the scope or the production of the podcast? Like, could you see yourself like when news is breaking during the day or something, like, having a producer who's scrambling to bring on guests and stuff like that? Or do you want it to be just this kind of summary type podcast?
For sure. The reason that I haven't staffed up for the Techmeme show right now is because I'm using the spillover to fund hopefully all of these other rides home. But then again, if they could get to the level that the Techmeme show is currently at, then they could staff up, right? Again, I like the franchise model in the sense that it wouldn't matter to me what the niche was. If it's delivering value to people, I almost, again, don't care what the editorial take would be, as long as you have an audience that you're serving that sort of TLDR as a service sort of thing for. That's great. And I come back to the whole idea of, bloggers, one-man band bloggers have gotten huge over the course of time. What's that conservative site that going back to the 90s, the Clinton Lewinsky
Red State?
Which one?
Oh, Red State? Like,
he broke the Clinton Lewinsky scandal stuff, and like,
the Drudge,
right?
Drudge, yeah.
Drudge was one guy or like two guys. It was Andrew Breitbart and Drudge for years or whatever, and they were making millions of dollars a year and getting more page views than the New York Times. Like, so there, it's again, I don't think that this is unprecedented that you could have a really lean operation and have like decent reach in podcasting. I don't know why no one's ever thought of that before. I'm sure that other people are pursuing it right now, but yeah, I don't know that you need to have a staff of 20. Now that's what makes the Daily at the New York Times great, is that you're leveraging the entire operations of the New York Times, which is what makes that fantastic. But yeah, I think lean one-man band podcasting can be very successful.
And what is your long-term platform strategy? Are you thinking about it? Because like up until now, it's been mainly you have an RSS feed, you publish a new episode, it gets populated into all the main podcast apps. Obviously iTunes or the Apple Podcast app is the biggest one. But now we're seeing, Spotify making these big entrants, the sites like Luminary. You're seeing things like the New York Times Daily getting syndicated on radio. Are you kind of, obviously Techmeme has a little bit of clout in the media world. Are there any kind of conversations about like trying to having something more than just an RSS feed, having exclusive content, or somehow getting like better distribution on platforms like Spotify? What are you noticing?
I'm not I don't know what I can say about that, but look, everybody, I think everyone in the podcast space right now is willing to talk to anybody at this point, right? And personally, I'm willing to entertain kissing anyone that'll bring me to the dance. So I'm very happy with podcasting in terms of like, the reach we're able to achieve, the scale we're able to achieve, the revenue that we're able to achieve. I'm not looking to pivot to video or anything like that. I'm happy to plow my lane right now. But yeah, I don't know. It's just like blogging. What we knew as blogging in the early 2000s essentially just became digital media as we know it today. I don't see why podcasting would be any different than that.
Well, let me put that question another way. Like, I was around during the golden age of blogging. That was back when the web was very decentralized. Then we saw this consolidation, especially with Facebook. A lot of blogging effectively moved to social media. People don't remember this, but like a lot of people had a lot of like casual blogs that are now, what we would think of as like Twitter accounts or your Facebook accounts. And then once Facebook consolidated that power, then it had tremendous influence on the media. And now we're seeing kind of the bad effects of that, especially as they've siphoned traffic away from traditional media sites. Do you worry about that happening? Because like now we're in the kind of golden age of podcasting, and everything's distributed through RSS. But now Spotify might be able to like throw its billions of dollars, consolidate those listeners, and then all of a sudden you're beholden to the Spotify algorithm.
Yes, putting it that way, could the platforms ruin podcasting? Will the platforms ruin podcasting? Probably. And am I worried about that? Of course. And am I fatalistic about that? Yeah. All I know is that right now it's fine. Do I hope that the platforms don't come in and ruin what makes podcasting great? Yes, I really, really hope they do. On the Internet History Podcast, I had Dave Weiner, inventor of the RSS of RSS.
RSS and podcasting.
And he bangs on about this, and blogging, by the way. He bangs on about this sort of thing a lot. Like, the open web needs to be open. Please stop platforming everything. Please stop posting your stuff on Medium. Like, you can have a blog. There's a reason. Like, don't give your stuff away to the platforms. I would love it. One of the reasons why podcasting is so valuable right now is because it is deplatformed, is because it is still a Wild West, is because what happens, as we've seen with all of digital media, is as soon as you put it on the platforms, as soon as you make it programmatic, it's a race to the bottom. It's the CPMs going down to naught, right? We've seen this happen with everything in digital media for the last 20 years. Podcasting, as of right now, through benign neglect by one of the biggest platforms, Apple, has escaped that. Long may it last. And all I can tell you is, we're over here trying to make hay while the sun shines, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Brian, those were all the questions I had. Where can people find you online?
At Brian MCC. Search for the Techmeme Ride Home podcast, search for the Primary Ride Home podcast. And I cannot stress this enough. We are looking to launch a dozen rides home over the next 18 months. It doesn't matter what the niche is, gaming, again, gardening, whatever. If you are an expert in a niche, if you're willing to work your ass off, but you want to help us put out a daily show in that niche, pitch it to us, because we would love. We're not trying to take the tack of, well, we should do a media ride home next. We should do a Wall Street ride home next, but we wouldn't know the right voices for that. So we'd rather find the right voice first and then make that niche happen than do it the other way around. So anyone listening, if you've got a good idea, pitch us. The website is ridehome.info.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.